Live. How's everyone doing today? I know that this is a little bit less time than we usually have between saying we're starting the broadcast and actually starting the broadcast. But I'm going to give folks a minute to trickle in. I don't know if you can tell, my voice is a little bit off. I'm still recovering a little bit from Concrud from PAX East, which is one of the downsides of traveling to larger events, is in a hall with 60, 70, 80,000 people, a higher chance that somebody has something that you end up catching. Mad Dog Max TV asks, do you know if players can swap decks from day 1 to day 2? I'm not sure what event you're talking about, but generally, no. I For Galactics, given that it is a different event, it is possible. But I don't know what that tournament structure is going to be. I'm going to assume no, that even though it is a distinct event in Melee, it is still considered all part of the same Galactic Championship event. But that is a question for the tournament organizer, which would be FFG. I don't have that information. Also, hello. It's been a hot minute. But yeah, I'm also going to just touch on a couple things. I know that I have a bunch of messages in Discord and my email waiting for responses. I'm going to get to those as soon as I can. I've, as mentioned, been a little bit under the weather, and so I'm just going to try and catch up as soon as I can with those right after this broadcast. I also know that a bunch of apprentices have gotten emails at this point regarding merch kits. For those merch kits, I know that some people got one email saying you can purchase one merch kit or the other merch kit, and then didn't, until the second email, realize that they were only eligible for one, and so ordered both. If somebody has ordered multiple kits and we're not supposed to, we're not going to cancel the whole order. We'll only cancel and refund the part of the order that they weren't supposed to. Barry Everson says they should do a tournament at a major event just for judges to play in and receive Judge Promos as prizes. I love judge tournaments. One of the challenges is finding the time to do that. Even if it is a 3-round event at best of 1, the judges aren't going to be available until the end of the shift, which for some larger events can be 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. And spending 2 hours immediately at the end of the shift before you're able to get dinner, you're out of the hall at midnight, and then you have dinner, and some folks have to get on shift as early as 7 a.m. the next day, especially if you have a.m. shifts and p.m. shifts. So I'd love to see that. I'd love to see that somewhere. One of the things that I want to do is figure out a way to do like a judge pre-release league, at least online or something like that. But having ways for judges to play and connect is great. Possibly it's the day before, so like Thursdays or Fridays at events. At the meetup, we have some sort of like limited event where it's draft or sealed, and judges just play a few best of ones and have a little bit of fun there. Sunayumi says, when will we know if we got picked to judge Galactic Championship? I believe that Chris Allison and Aces are making the decisions on Friday, which will be in just a couple of days. But that should be the second major wave. I know there have been a couple acceptances and declines since that first wave, but not many. I think this Friday should be the bulk of everybody staffed for Galactics. Alrighty. As always, if folks have questions, just drop them in the chat. Otherwise, I want to get through this before I lose my voice recording this message. ST77M says, we'll be having a judge meetup in Vegas. Yes. The current plan is Thursday after the staff training, so Thursday evening, as it will be a 3-day event, and so the night before the event starts. But let's dive into Limited. So, we're going to be talking about limited formats. That's draft and sealed primarily. There are other limited formats that you may have heard of. Cube is a variation on draft. And then there's variations on the standard pick and pass draft format where you have Rochester and Winchester and grid drafting and a lot of other weird draft formats. We're not going to talk about those because a lot of those are generally designed for 2 or 4 players and have a lot more logistical overhead and therefore simply aren't run at large events. They're sort of more casual at home sorts of things rather than the standard play that you'll get in a LGS or at a large convention. But we're going to be talking about limited unlimited. It's a little weird to say that, but that's the name of the format type used across many other TCGs, and so developing new language at this point would be working against decades of habit. It's called limited because players are working from a limited pool of cards, usually the fully random sealed or the slightly more controlled nature of draft. However, there are other formats that come to the same place. But we want to talk about 4 things at baseline here that separate limited play from constructed play, at least from the perspective of judges. The strategy changes very much for players, but that's not something that I'm an expert in, and so that's not something that I'm going to discuss. But 1, distribution of product and player card acquisition, then deck construction and registration, the depth of the card pool, and how long the event takes. So, one of the most obvious elements that separates limited events from constructed is just how much stuff you have. Because with constructed, players bring their deck and then they're ready to go. With limited, players don't bring a deck at all. And they don't have to bring any cards, in fact. And so you're the one who's providing all of the cards for all of the decks for all of the players. For constructed events, at most, you're handing out like a promo, maybe a playmat. For sealed, you're doing that in addition to pre-release kits or individual packs. For draft, you need to ensure that the whole draft process happens appropriately with players seated in the correct seats. 3 packs each player. People are opening packs at the right time. For a lot of events, particularly at local level events and casual tier events, you can just hand a pack to a player as they show up. Like, they register for a sealed event, and you're like, here are your 6 packs, we're going to get started in 10 minutes. Just remind them not to open the packs until they're told to open their packs, just because, everybody gets 30 minutes for deck construction. If somebody opens 10 minutes early, they get a little bit more time. So, very frequently, particularly for either non-local events or competitive events or both, you're going to want to not distribute the product until players have sat down. Quick tangent, Excalibur 444 says, will the judge meet up in Vegas be limited to judges judging the Galactic or any registered judge? The goal for meetups is going to be any registered judge, and generally we're going to try and host them in areas where you don't need a badge to get in. So for PAX East, we held it in a hotel lobby, and so it included folks on staff, not on staff, and folks who... I think everybody who showed up did have a badge for PAX, but if you didn't have a badge for PAX and you were just in the area, you could have showed up as well. For Vegas, it will be coming after the judge training. The judge training will be only for judges on staff, because it is training for the judges working the Galactic Championship. So, meetup is open, training is staff only because it is staff training. But moving back to limited events, for sealed events, you're just going to have everybody sit down, generally in a seat that isn't their round 1 seat, but a seat for deck construction, and then you'll hand out packs there. For draft, players sit according to the software. If you have more than 11 players, it will generate multiple pods. Drafting and consequently booster draft format are intended for 8-player pods. When drafting with exactly 8 players, each player will see most packs twice, some packs only once. With a smaller pod, you see some packs 3 times. With larger pods, you see most packs only once, which significantly changes the dynamic of the draft itself. Tournament software will generally try to make the greatest number of 8-player pods while creating the smallest number of worse experience pods. For example, if you have 18 players, rather than having 2 9-player pods or 3 6-player pods, you'll have an 8 and a 10. Melee will handle this podding of players on its own. You just tell it what your ideal pod size is, whether it's 4 or 8, and it'll just go from there. I think there's some really awkward numbers. There's some number out there where it's just a bunch of 7-player pods, because that's the best experience. Like, it's the best average experience, even though it's subpar for everyone, rather than being like, you have one 8-player pod, and then like a 5-player pod and a 12-player pod. It's just everybody suffers at 7. But I can't remember what that player count is, and we don't have to worry about that. Melee will take care of it. Pods are usually self-contained units, with players only playing players within the pod. That means they're only going to be playing against folks who have seen the same cards that they did, and so it's a little bit more equitable in that way. If there's a pod that just happens to have a lot of heroic cards, or a lot of you have a bunch of packs in that pod with double or triple rares, that's going to affect the whole pod equally, as opposed to you being in the pod where you get 3 packs with triple rares, and then play against somebody whose pod had no packs with triple rares, and so you have 2 or 3 times as many rares or legendaries as those other players. We keep things within pod, so everybody's working in the same constraints. Players should also be an appropriate seat within their pod. For casual tier pods, this matters a little bit less, but Melee assigns a pod and a seat within pod. It does not assign a table number. You can manually add those table numbers after generating, but before publishing the pods. In a standard 8-player pod, players who have seats 1, 2, 3, and 4 will sit in a row, and then across for them will be 5, 6, 7, 8. So 1 is seated across from 8, 4 is seated across from 5. This makes it so that pairings also happen naturally. This seating is important because each player's first opponent is the player who's seated farthest from them. So 1 plays 5, 4 plays 8, 2 plays 6, and 3 plays 7, if I'm remembering my numbers correctly. This is sometimes referred to as Gentle Giant 303 says in chat, big X, little x. As if you draw a line from each player to their first round opponent, it creates a big X and a little x, a nice little cross pattern. Similarly, each player's second round opponent will generally, I think always, but I'm not confident enough to say always in the lesson, but I am enough to say it on this. Each player's second round opponent will be a player seated 1 seat away from them. So if you are seated at seat 1, your next round opponent will either be 3 or 5, and then if you're seated at 5, you'll also play 3 or 7s, because 3, 7 played each other. One of them lost, one of them won. 1, 5 played each other. One of you lost, one of you won. And so you're going to be able to pair somebody with the same record. And then in the final round, it's the first chance you have to play somebody who is seated next to you. So round 3 of a draft is the first chance for somebody who's seated at seat 1 to play against somebody in seat 2 or seat 8. It's also possible that they play 4 or 6, just based on record. But the idea is the person who you have the most information about because you were seated next to them in the draft is the person that you play last in the tournament. So that's all unnecessary information, but it's nice to know, and it helps you understand the structure of pods. That way, when you get to non-standard pod sizes, you understand what the software is trying to do and what the goals of pairing are. But for the draft itself, we're still in this card acquisition phase. There are 2 phases to a Star Wars Unlimited draft. You start off with a leader draft, where each player opens all 3 of their packs, and you take out the pack, and on one side you'll have card back, on the other you'll have the leader. Put the pack face down, take the leader out, set the pack off to the side so that you don't see any of the cards in the pack. If you do happen to see the next card, it's going to be a base, it's going to be a common base, and so that's not really spoilers. It doesn't give you additional information about your draft, but it's better to just have it wholly face down as soon as you can to make sure that you're not accidentally seeing whatever that first card is. You're going to do that for all 3 packs until you have your 3 leaders off to the side. I only have 2 in my hands, which is unfortunate, but then you're going to draft and pass them along off to the side, passing to the right. You're going to get past 2 packs or 2 leaders. You'll pick one, pass one, and grab the last one. As Hedkin says, leaving the cards in the booster wrapper is a great way to ensure that you don't accidentally grab the cards too early. It does mean for judges for trash collection, we're going to want to actually swing by and pick up wrappers a little bit later than you would in other games. But keeping stuff in the wrapper means that you're like, this is not what I am drafting, nobody grab this, which is a very good tip and something that I would generally recommend folks do. Once you've gotten all 3 leaders, you just put them either face up in front of you. People will be able to see them, so folks know what leader everybody's drafting with, so we're all operating on the same information. The reason we don't allow you to hide this information is because at the beginning of the draft, if you were being eagle-eyed or if you picked quickly, you'd be able to look around, see what everybody else picked as their leader, because double-sided cards are really hard to hide both faces during the draft. And then if somebody has that information and then hides their leader picks under their other picks, they are denying information that they have that other players don't have. Leaving all leaders face up for the duration of the draft means that everybody gets to operate with the same information. Gentle Giant 303 says, when you're picking up trash wrappers, make sure to crumple it in your hand so you don't pick up a full pack. Absolutely. Also, if you're doing a weirder draft, if you're doing, say, a Carbonite draft, or in a couple years if you do a Spark of Rebellion draft, some players might want to keep the wrappers as souvenirs. That's a little bit weird for me, but some people do want to keep those pack wrappers just as a reminder of that experience. Once you have drafted your leaders, then the draft begins in earnest. You're going to select one of your packs at random. It doesn't matter which one because you don't know the contents of any of them. You're going to look at that. You're going to remove the common base / token and set it off to the side, generally throwing it in the middle or putting it with your leaders in case that is a base that you think you're going to want or it's a token that you need, that sort of thing. What you're going to do is look at the pack. You're going to pick the best card in the pack or your favorite card or whatever card you want to take, put it into a face-down pile right in front of you, and pass that first pack to the left. I know I'm passing to the right, but don't worry about it. Then you'll grab the pack that is being passed to you, look at that, pick a card, and repeat this process. Once you've gone through the entire pack, you have completed the draft process for that pack. While you're doing so, there are 3 zones. As Hedkin says, respect the zones. There are the cards you have that you're currently holding in your hand, the cards that you have passed, and the cards that are being passed to you. Don't have more than 1 set of cards in any zone. You control 2 of these zones directly, the cards that you're holding and the cards that you are passing. If you've passed a pack and you've already made your pick for the next pack, and the player next to you hasn't picked up the pack that you just passed to them, don't pass your pack. Just hold on to it. Just sit there, wait patiently, wait for them to draft, and then pass the pack. By keeping cards as physically separate as possible, having these 3 zones, you massively decrease the chance that you get 2 packs shuffled together or stuck on top of each other or mixed in, lost, that sort of thing. Recovering drafts is doable. It's just a little bit tricky and a little bit frustrating because it takes some time. Similarly, as a bonus 4th zone, there are the cards that you have already drafted. During the casual tier draft process, you're allowed and able to look at the cards you've already drafted, so long as you're not holding another set of cards. So you have those cards in a single face-down pile in front of you. If you've passed a pack, if you want to quickly take a look, see how many units you've drafted, see if you've drafted enough removal, that sort of thing, you can look at it, put it back down, and then grab the next pack. However, what you cannot do is be looking at a pack and looking at your draft picks and be like, ooh, what do I want to do? Because there's a very good chance that even unintentionally, unconsciously, you bring the cards together and you're like, these two sets are separate, but the other drafters have no way of knowing if you swapped cards. And so it is important to keep those sets very distinct. Only have one set of cards in your hand at any given time. If you want to do a competitive level draft, you and your store can choose to do that. More rigor and precise timing may be required. Other TCGs have very strict time limits based on the number of cards remaining in the pack. You start with I can't remember the numbers for Magic or Flesh and Blood, but you start with 45 seconds, then the next pick is 40, then 35, 30, 30, 25, 25, 20, 20, 15, 15, 10, 10, 5, 5, 5, 5, or something along those lines. Don't do that unless you have multiple pods drafting simultaneously and it is competitive. The idea is to help synchronize all the drafts to make sure that everything's happening smoothly. You don't need to do that at the local level. Absolutely, you do not need to do that if you have a single pod or if it's casual tier. It's only if you have multiple large competitive draft pods happening where you would want to time picks. They create a lot of stress for the players. They're very intimidating to have somebody shouting at you, you have 60 seconds, pick up the pack. 5 seconds remaining, make a pick. Put down 13 cards. Pick up the pack, you have 55 seconds. 5 seconds remain. It is stressful for players. It's also stressful for judges. But it does add a lot of value to higher level draft events. And we might talk about that more later if we ever have formal competitive events. The Amazing Beaver says, hi, it's me, Sebastian from PAX East. Just saying hi, thanks for the help and allowing to play and watch other judges. Awesome. I'm glad that you had a great experience. I'm excited to see you again at any events that we're both at. It's a lot of fun. I'm seeing we have some folks saying called drafts are the worst. The stress is part of the fun. Called drafts are great. Called drafts are an experience. Let's put it that way. Some people love them. Some people hate them. But for sealed events, so in draft, that's after the first pack, you grab your second pack. This time you're passing to the right, so the player that was passing to you is now being passed to by you. And then for the third pack, you go back to passing to the left, and so the player that was just passing to you and was being passed cards to you in pack 1 is the person who will be receiving your packs in pack 3. So just left, right, left. And again, that's the opposite direction because I don't know my directions, and everything's flipped on my display for OBS. But with sealed events at casual tier, at nice, easy, regular, standard play, have them open the 6 packs, have them make a deck. That's it. For more competitive events, you might want to do pool registration and possibly even deck registration. This absolutely should not be done for casual tier events. It's way too much of a headache, and it's not something that you really need to worry about for like a pack per win sort of deal. The best way to register a sealed pool is to have somebody other than the player who opened the packs register the pool. There are 2 ways of doing this. One, you have your entire judge staff spend the night before opening hundreds, if not thousands, of booster packs, registering the pools, and then wrapping a deck list around that set of cards. It's a pain in the butt. It takes a lot of time. You're going to make mistakes. It's going to be frustrating. And even with a full staff of 20 or 30 judges, it takes a long time. The other way to do it is just have another player in the event do the registration for you. Begin by seating players randomly for this process. You don't want to seat people alphabetically because that means that there's a high chance that they're seated next to family members who have a small incentive, not a ton, but an incentive to help friends and family. So you seat players randomly for a deck construction process. Have half of your event, usually players who are facing one side of the hall, so everybody who's facing the registration desk, the store counter, everybody who's facing the entrance of the hall, you have them open their packs first. You can also denote this distinction by having 2 colors of deck registration sheets, having light blue sheets and plain white sheets, and just say everybody who has a blue deck list, you're going to do this now. What you do is they open their packs, reveal the cards to the player seated across from them, put the cards in a face-down pile, open the next pack, face-down pile. This way, the player sees, yes, this pack was legitimately opened. This was the double triple rare pack. Yeah, they got the foil rare. They got the foil rare, the rare, and the hyper rare in the uncommon spot. Great. I'm so happy for them. But having them see you open the packs means that once you've opened 6 packs, we repeat the process on the other side. The other player opens those 6 packs, shows them to the player seated across from them. Now both players have seen what the other person has opened. You hand them your 6 packs along with the deck registration sheet, and the player who watched you open your pool writes down all of the cards that you opened. Generally, this will be not handwriting the names of the cards, but it'll be a list of all of the cards in the set, and you just tally how many cards of each type there are in the pool. While you're doing so, you generally want to sort the pool. That is generally the fastest way to do it, and if we ever get to this point where it is formally supported, we'll have an in-depth lesson talking about how to maximize this process, minimize the number of errors, make it as efficient and timely as possible. When players are opening the packs, though, it is not a time for sorting or deliberation or talking about what cards you have. McFerguson says this sounds like entirely too much work for the casual vibes drafting that you enjoy. Absolutely. Do not do this at casual. Absolutely not. But if you had, say, a 2K that was sealed because you wanted to run a 2K sealed event, or if FFG decides to have, say, a sector qualifiers at competitive and doing a sealed sector qualifiers, you would want to have deck lists. You wouldn't want to have no deck list, and you wouldn't want to have players register their own pools, because then it is very, very easy for somebody to be like, what a coincidence. I just happened to open 3 Darth Vaders in my pool. I'm so lucky. And so for a competitive tier event, you need more rigor. But for casual play, absolutely do not do this. You should not be doing this for casual play at all. Just open the packs, have them build the packs. Or build the decks. But we have the 2 sides of the table do this at separate times, because if they're opening packs at the same time, they're not going to be paying attention to what the other player's opening. They're going to be looking at the cool cards that they opened. Once all players have opened the packs, we pass them, we register them. Then, after we've registered them, we pass the packs back, and players can build their decks. Like with drafting, this registration deck construction process should be generally silent. Players should not be constructing decks or discussing what cards are good until we're in the deck construction process, and should not be discussing what cards are good at any point, or being like the occasional comment of, holy crap, you opened 3 Darth Vaders, that's insane, is fine even at competitive. But we do want to say, hey, this should generally be a silent process. If there's a missing player, and so you have no player seated across from you, that player should just integrate themselves into their neighbors and pass in a triangle. Now it's time for deck construction. And God, my voice is going. We'll see if that helps any. Not really, but so deck construction is timed and limited to 30 minutes, both at competitive, casual, sealed, draft, anything. 30 minutes. Now, at casual tier, players are explicitly allowed to change their deck, including leader and base, between every game and every match. So some amount of chatter is entirely appropriate and acceptable, especially at events like pre-releases for casual tier events. This is because, in a casual tier event, you build your deck, you play around, or you after you finish deck construction, you go talk to your friends and they're like, hey, your deck is bad. Between games or between rounds, you're allowed to just change your deck freely at any point during the event. Therefore, if you're allowed to get advice after the turn, after deck construction has started, after round one, like there's no need to be as vigilant about it. It also is better for newer players, which we see a lot of at pre-release, or more casual players who only show up for the one event. Just being like, hey, do you think Timely Reinforcements is good in my deck? What about Prototype TIE Advanced? How should I balance? Like, what colors do you think are good for me? That's entirely fine at pre-release. Entirely fine. At a competitive event, no, you're not allowed to talk to anybody because we are testing your deck construction skill. So, players are limited to using the leaders that they either drafted or were in their pool for sealed, with the exception of also being allowed to use pre-release promo leaders during pre-release events. Players are not restricted only to the bases they drafted. They're allowed to use any common base for the set or their functional equivalent. Players are also not restricted to card limits other than those printed on cards, like our good friend Swarming Vulture Droids, and what they acquired. If a player drafted 12 Warzone Lieutenants, they're allowed to play all 12 Warzone Lieutenants. And finally, and this one is obvious but we state it anyways, players are only allowed to play with cards from their drafted or sealed card pool. They can't use cards that they otherwise own, can't trade for cards from other players within the event. I know some newer players will absolutely believe that they could be like, oh, that rare that you opened is super awesome and is bad in your deck and would be great in mine. I'll give you this rare that's bad in my deck and good in yours in exchange for your rare. And since we both opened these in the event, it's fine and fair because they were randomly opened. That's not allowed. If you discover somebody doing that, 99% of the time, they have no idea that that's not allowed. Just let them know that that's not what's supposed to be happening. Trading for cards out of binders and out of backpacks, that's a little bit more suspect, but very, very few people will ever do that because it's generally just not worth it. So, that's deck construction and card acquisition and all of that good stuff. The next thing that we want to talk about, it looks like I've frozen on my camera. Give me a second. There we go. Hey, face is moving again. Alright, so, McFerguson, that might be my internet. I've seen myself freeze a couple of times. My audio has looked clear, but the camera has not looked clear. Barry Everson says, if I opened Hyperfoil Devastator or Showcase and don't want to risk damage, can I show a judge and play a basic version in my deck? Generally, yes. Just talk to a judge and make sure that that gets cleared. Some folks will say no, not allowed. But generally, like, even at competitive tier, if you're just like, hey, I opened a foil and it's already starting to warp because we're playing in Florida and the humidity is getting to it immediately, I would like to play with a not marked card. You can go out and find a non-foil version, swap it in, and just be like, hey, the name matches the name. So, yeah, you'd absolutely be able to swap cards out. Just talk with the judge first, especially at competitive tier events. Am I no longer frozen? We're going to just ask chat if we're no longer frozen. Waiting for a response. Great, fantastic. Fantastic. So Barry Everson, yeah, you've done that locally. Just want to make sure it was okay in other non-local events. That is entirely fine. The idea is that you are playing with the card identities that you've opened. I've even seen players like open a prestige or showcase version of a card and be like, hey, I don't want to play this version because it'll take damage, I just want to sell it. I do have another copy of this card from a different set. Can I use that? Um, so, that's something you can do. You'll get a lot more weird looks because people will be like, that's not legal in this form. And you're like, I opened this hyperfoil version or like this prestige version and I just didn't want to damage it. I spoke with a judge. But let's talk about depth of card pool. With decks constructed, you pay around 1. The tournament functions similarly to a normal tournament. But there are a couple things. One of them is this card pool issue. While the card pool is limited only to the cards from the set or sets if multiple steps are being drafted, it can actually result in a higher number of different cards being played, because sometimes you just need a 30th card that's in your aspect, or you need a space unit, and Corellian Freighter is the only card in your pool that is a space unit that isn't already in your deck. And so people will be playing all 262 cards that are in a set. I'm not sure how many different cards see play in Constructed right now. I'm sure it's more than 260, right? I mean, maybe not. Like, if a meta deck is roughly 20 unique cards, you need to have 13 meta decks with no overlap before a limited format has less depth than a constructed format. So you're going to just see a lot more cards in limited, and it's going to be cards that you're not familiar to seeing or not familiar to seeing in those contexts. There's some cards, like let's say War Juggernaut, that you're like, oh yes, I'm used to seeing this in every Django deck ever. But then maybe you watch somebody play some Jump Limited and you're like, okay, that's a War Juggernaut in a Thrawn deck because they're red-blue Thrawn and they just needed a ground unit. That's weird. Okay. There's no weird interaction with War Juggernaut and Thrawn, but you're going to start to see more cards in places you don't expect them and more weird interactions simply because you're not used to them. Plus, limited formats change. Yes, constructed formats change, but they evolve over time. When we add set 6 or set 5, when we add Legends of the Force, yes, the meta is going to change. People are going to be playing new leaders. There are going to be new cards in old decks. But a lot, like, I bet you Sabine is still going to be a pretty popular aggro deck even after Legends of the Force. I wouldn't be surprised if Rey was also in a very similar place, just with more cards. Whereas with Sealed, you're going to watch somebody build a Revan deck and be like, that is not a deck that I've seen before. And every single time someone builds a Revan deck, it's going to be completely new, just because of the access that they have. Most of the time, these cards are generally weaker and less complex, because more complexity generally leads to more power, and more power leads to more play in Constructed. But sometimes there'll just be a card that's very niche and does something very strange that only sees play in Draft or Limited. The other noticeable impact is the length of the tournament. For a competitive event with a 40-player tournament, you'd play 6 rounds with a cut to top 8, just like you would with a constructed event. But you also probably spent close to an hour on pool registration, deck construction, distributing product, and if your top 8 has new decks, you're spending that time again. And so that's possibly 2 hours longer than a similarly sized constructed event. Even with a casual tier event, like a pre-release, going from 4 best-of-1 rounds to 4 rounds and 30 minutes for deck construction increases the total length of the tournament by 25% for no additional matches played. So just keep in mind that sealed tournaments, limited tournaments, are just going to take more time. There isn't much you can do about it, but you just get to be aware of it and know that those days are going to be longer. If you do decide, if your store's like, yeah, we want to run a 100-player sealed event or 128 player draft event with, what is that? That's not 8 pods? No, that's 64. So 16 pods. Yeah, 16 pods gets you 128 players. If you're like, yeah, they want to run 16 pods of draft before cutting to a top 8. Or like you do 16 pods and then the winners all go into their pods and like everybody who's a whatever, you have your top 8 cut, that sort of thing. Yeah, that adds up to a lot of time. If you start having multiple drafts, multiple sealed builds, it just adds up. And so it can make what is reasonable, like a 7-round event plus top 8 is reasonable for a single day. It's a lot, but it's reasonable. Doing that for limited is 2 or 3 hours longer, which stops being reasonable because you go from 10 or 11 hours to 13 to 14 hours, which is the entire conscious time. So that is limited structure. To answer some questions, Mad Dog Max TV says, what was your win-loss at PAX East? I won 1 or 2 games, and I think those were against players who, or judges who didn't have their own deck, and so they were playing against my other deck. And I think I won against somebody's very brewy brew that was a little bit of a meme deck. But other than that, every single real deck I lost to. Mightstone 12420 says side events at GC will have Legends of the Force and could have cards still waiting on rulings. Absolutely. The good news there is that we will also have many members of the FFG team on site, including some developers. And so if something comes up, heck, Legends of the Force is going to be legal for the main event. And so there might be cards that people are playing in the main event that are waiting on rulings. And if we're like, oh, this interaction is coming up a lot, we weren't anticipating this, we can run over and ask in person, be like, hey, this is a high priority. Can we get an answer on this now? But generally, judges do and will continue to have their discretion to rule to the best of their ability, even if a clarification will be forthcoming eventually. Mad Dog Max TV asks, what did I play? I played Set 1 Palette Blue and Fennec Red with a big old stack of Judge promos in them. About half of both decks are just Judge promos, which means that roughly like 10 cards in each deck are completely unplayable. Playing Luke off aspect makes the card a whole lot worse. Vader, Dooku, and Maul off aspect also just not a great deal. Paying 7 for Maul, paying 10 for Dooku, like, those aren't great places to be. So, we move on now to communication and policy philosophy. This one got a little bit more philosophical. I started writing this when the con crud was starting to hit me, so I maybe got a little bit loopy and was just like, I'm in my head talking about philosophy now. Yeah. Policy philosophy is not something that is expected of level 2 judges, not mastery at least. Policy philosophy is very important, but really, policy knowledge is broken down into 3 silos. There's what, how, and why. And at L2, we expect you to know what policy is. We expect you to know how to handle, like, what the basics of it is. What are all the categories of infraction, what the penalties mean, generally how to handle that. At level 3, we expect you to know how to handle these. We expect you to reflexively be able to deal with card manipulation error or gameplay disruptions. We want you to just know how to do that without having to think about it, except for strange situations. But if a straightforward by-the-book thing comes up, at level 2, we want you to know where to look to figure out you need to do, and to generally have an idea of what you need to do, if not have it like that. At level 3, we want you to have it like that for those common cases. At level 4 and 5, we want you to understand why it's written the way that it's written. Now I'm going to have a leg up on this because I'm going to be writing it, so I'll know what was going through my mind, but one of the things that I'll be trying to do throughout the level 2, 3, and higher lessons is explain the thought process behind the policy decisions so that you understand the philosophy. Sort of like how when we were talking about limit and draft pairings, whereas like you want your seat 1 to play against seat 5, and then they play against 3-7, and then they'll play against one of these 4 players because it blah 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 blah. Understanding that why means that when it all breaks down, because it will break down, you understand what the goals are and how we got there. Because policy is by its very nature very interpretive. Most of the time you're gonna just do what policy says, because most of the time policy will cover what we are running into. Some of the time, policy won't cover what happens. There's a classic scenario that I've encountered a couple times myself, where a player has their deck just on the table, nobody's touching it, it's just sitting there, and then the top card of the deck flips over, face up on the table. Nobody was anywhere near it, just magically, top card of the deck flips over. A player has now seen a card that they shouldn't. In fact, both players have now seen a card that they shouldn't. How do you handle this? Well, I'm going to tell you this. Policy isn't going to cover acts of air conditioner blasts knocking cards off decks. We're not going to write policy to cover that. Because while I have seen it happen, I've seen it happen twice in hundreds, if not thousands of events. So sometimes things happen in the real world that you just can't predict. What happens? What is the policy for if there is a fire alarm and the building needs to be evacuated? How do you handle that? We're not going to write that down in policy because it is not common enough of an occurrence to warrant that sort of direction. And if we included everything that we've ever seen happen, the policy document would be probably like an order of magnitude longer than the comprehensive rules, and we really don't want a 700-page document, because then when you're like, hey, can somebody tell me about how stock standard card manipulation is handled? We'd be like, okay, card manipulation errors pages 300 to 400. Good luck. There's a lot going on. So how you handle some of the stuff outside of policy is going to be left up to your judgment, hence the title Judges. To answer the various questions for, like, the card manipulation error where the AC knocked the card over, we just had the player shuffle into their deck, no penalty was issued, and we moved the table so they weren't directly under event. For alarms, we just killed the round. We're just like, hey, I'm sorry if you've already won your match, but this round, like, we need everybody get out of the hall now. This building is not something that we can have you in. Please leave. Like, yes, leave your cards. We understand that that's not what we want. Like, that is a difficult thing to do. But, like, everybody get out. Judges, make sure players get out. Make sure nobody's scooping decks up off tables. Great. Everybody's out. Fire department comes through, clears the building. Judges, you go back in first. Okay, we're going to allow folks back in by event. It looks like I've frozen again. Let me see. Aha! No longer frozen. Great. So then we had judges come back in before players, had players come back in, event by event. And then once everybody was back in their seat, we said, hey, this round can't continue. It has been, like, there's been too much disruption to this round. We're going to just start this round from scratch. I'm sorry if you've already won this round. Also, I'm sorry if you've already lost this round. but we're just gonna repair this round. And that was for a 1,000+ player event. That was not clean, but that was what we had best as option on the table. But all that is to say, policy will never cover everything. Similarly, like, we can talk about communication. Next lesson on Thursday, we're going to talk about reversing decisions and what is information. And that's going to remain somewhat vague forever, and I know that's going to bother a lot of people. But I cannot encompass the whole of human communication in policy. And so what we do is we give guidelines and we give examples so that you understand what the goals are and how we got there. Reversing decisions is a tough one. Reversing decisions is something that in other TCGs is constrained to higher level judges only. And even when it's not constrained to just like L3 pluses, it is even if it's not constrained to L3 pluses, it's check with somebody else, because that it is always a high contention area. McFerguson says, why repair, not just start over with the same pairings? Nothing should have changed in standings if the round in progress is being entirely washed, right? However, people now have information of what the person they were playing against was playing. And so if they were in game one, they may have kept a different hand. And so you have the information gain is unequal. Because some people like finished their match and already won. But they might have lost if their opponent had kept a different opening hand, knowing what decks and what tech that they were playing. And so repairing gets rid of that information gain. But I think that, like, not just starting over with the same pairings is also potentially a valid solution. It's also potentially valid to just say, continue this match from where we were. We're going to add some time to get there. McFerguson said, do you need to reassign pairings manually since Melee will use the same math? So Melee will use this. So Melee does, there's some amount of random in Melee. If you pair a round and then delete the round and pair it again, people will be paired differently, except for, I believe, the final round for some events. Like, for some games, the final round is strict by standing, so first place, second place, or third place, fourth, fifth place, sixth, etc., etc. Power pairings, I believe it's called in Magic and maybe Flesh and Blood, but most other rounds are semi-random, and so you'll still be paired against somebody with the same record, and if, like, you're the two undefeated players when this incident happens, you'll be paired against each other, but otherwise, you'll still be semi-randomly paired. Some people might have the same pairings, but most people would have new pairings. And so Melee uses the same math, but it also uses a little bit of randomness. At least is my understanding. So, let's talk a little bit about communication. Some communication is with words, some communication with gestures or actions, some is a mix of the two. Some will be grunts and shrugs. Some, like, people will meme as communication. Like, some people will dab and just be like, yes, this means I concede. And some people are like, yeah, that's what we do at our store. When we're conceding, we dab. Like, that's a thing. And people will get really confused when you do that at a larger event, because that's not a traditional means of communication. Furthermore, like, how people communicate changes based on where in the world you are, and can change as locally as one game store to the next. Communication policy strives to help players align so that the game rolls out smoothly. The goal of any communication policy is to keep games fun and fair. Our job as judges is to make sure players have fun and want to keep on playing the game. And one of the ways we do that is by ensuring that things are fair. We want the game to end with the rules having been followed, the person who played better, built their deck better, drew the right cards, to be the person winning. But we also want both players to feel satisfied with that outcome. We don't want to show up to a match and just point at a player and say that player wins, because that gets people to be just frustrated because they're like that wasn't a natural outcome. We want to have natural outcomes to our games. We generally want to bring things as close as possible to the way things should have been, but we are not always going to be able to do that, especially as soon as information has been revealed or actions have been taken. Going back in time is not a power that we actually have, even though we have backups and rewinds. Things still happen. People still know about actions. To that end, an underlying idea that you should have when you are suggesting an improvement to philosophy is, how would two players, if they were playing casually at home, resolve this issue? This is where the core of fixes should generally come. There are some things that change a little bit differently once you start playing for higher stakes. But like the idea of, hey, I paid 4 resources for a Vanquish, I needed to pay 5, I'll just exhaust this last resource. That's how 2 players would handle it at home. And that is, as long as they didn't use that resource for anything, as long as their opponent didn't like play around them having that extra resource up significantly, just exhausting that resource is fine. Similarly, like, oh, you have an issue with your deck, how would you fix this if you were just playing at home? You'd be like, hey, I'm not, like, I was trying out these cards, turns out I didn't actually want them in my deck, can I switch to the cards that I meant to be playing? Again, if you're playing at home, your friend would be like, oh yeah, absolutely, just fix it. That makes it so that the fixes are also intuitive to players. If they can realize how we got to the fix that we got to, they'd be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, I agree and I accept. It's important not to treat calls as though they are casual no-stakes games, especially when they are not casual low-stakes games, like at sectors or regional qualifiers. But what is a fair and reasonable fix, what is fair and reasonable policy, generally doesn't change from casual play to competitive play. You want to make sure that the player who made the error or communicated less is not gaining an advantage from their error or lack of communication. And you want to make sure that the game state is as close to legal as possible. Those are really your guiding lights when thinking about policy philosophy. Now, there are some weird fixes that we have. The card manipulation fix of reveal your hand to your opponent, they pick cards, those cards go where they say they are, etc., etc. That's, a lot of players would grok, oh yeah, we take a card at random, we put it back. But a lot of players also will very quickly grasp that results in the player who drew the extra card possibly keeping a card that they shouldn't have access to, gaining an advantage. And so if we explain it in the framework of there's a small chance that the card that they drew is not the card that's returned and is the card that they need to win, and so we want to make sure that it is not that. And so they are slightly disadvantaged by that policy. They are losing the best card in their hand, but it's mitigating any potential advantage. The Amazing Beaver says, on competitive play, if both players agree to a solution of the error problem, would you be able to continue, or is it a matter of always bringing a judge? If both players agree to a resolution and the game state ends up in a legal state, you don't need to intervene. And so if I go Vanquish for 4, kill your thing, and your opponent's like, that costs 5, I'm like, oh right, sorry, I thought it was takedown for whatever reason. And then I just exhaust the 5th resource. We are in a legal state, both players are happy with it, you don't need to get a judge involved. I would like to have a judge involved just to track that error, but if the players resolve things quickly and to both players' satisfaction, and the game ends up in a legal state, you don't have to worry about it. If they're like, oh, just leave that resource unexhausted and you'll have that extra resource, it'll be fine. Be like, hey, we want the game to be legal, please. Can you exhaust that resource? But if both players agree to a fix quickly, absolutely. If it looks like they're hemming and hawing, feel free to step in and offer your assistance. Don't be ham-handed about it. Don't, like, slap players down. But if the players are happy with it, that's okay, because they believe that they've reached a fair situation, or a fair resolution, rather. It is important, especially with the judge program being young and the game being young, that we normalize calling judges and make it so that calling judges doesn't feel punitive. We want to make sure that players feel better about calling a judge. We don't want players to call a judge and then be like, oh, that I feel like I just shouldn't have called a judge because that was a worse outcome for both of us. We would have solved it better on our own. We want to avoid that, because as soon as we start doing that, players will stop calling judges, and then cheaters will be able to prosper because there's less oversight. So as a player, if you're a judge and a player, always call a judge. If you're a player, always call a judge. But also, if you just solve things to your own satisfaction, it's fine. Just as a judge/player, never be like, don't worry, I'm a judge, we'll fix this, if it's an error that you made. Like if you accidentally don't exhaust enough resources or you draw an extra card, even if you're giving the right resolution, it looks just shady to be like, don't worry, I'm watching over myself. You don't have to worry about me cheating because I'm just so perfect. That's just a bad look. It's a bad perception. If your opponent makes an error, you can be like, hey, I'm a judge, I can walk us through how to fix this. Or if you want somebody who's impartial to the outcome of this match, let's call a judge. I think it's always call a judge. It normalizes judges, it makes judges a little bit more approachable and accessible, and it shows that judges aren't here to punish players. So, we've been talking a lot about philosophy so far. So let's talk about information, communication regarding information. We have two types of information per the rules and policy. There's hidden information, also known as private. I think it's hidden information, private knowledge, and open information, public knowledge. These types are labeled differently in the rules and documents, but open and public are effectively interchangeable. Hidden, private, similarly interchangeable. Open information is information that is available to both players, and players must answer honestly when asked about open information by their opponent. The number of cards in a player's hand, deck, sideboard, and resource zone, all open information. The amount of damage on a player's base and units. Previous actions from this phase. Text of cards that were previously revealed. The card, status, and attributes of all face-up cards in play or in discard, and the reverse side of leaders and any captured cards. Hidden information is information that is restricted in its availability in some way. All information that is not another information type is by default hidden, but players can gain access to hidden information through various game mechanics. Unless otherwise granted, a player is not entitled to know the attributes or location of cards in a deck, the attributes of the cards played as resource by other players, and the attributes of cards in other players' hands. That's relatively straightforward. Players must do their best to communicate open information. Most of the time, that information is still going to be available. The card is going to be face up, and so when your opponent says, hey, how much HP does Grogu have, you'll be able to look at Grogu and say 5 very easily. Or 5 damage with 3 damage marked on him. If a player intentionally misrepresents open information, such as giving incorrect information about how much damage is on their base, they should be investigated for cheating. Remember that the player must know what they are doing is illegal and must do it intentionally. So, if, like, I have a base with 27 damage marked on it, but it's actually 28 damage because I just haven't updated it yet, I have not intentionally miscommunicated that. I just haven't updated it yet. Similarly, if I, reveal a card, like you played Spark of Resistance, or Spark of Rebellion against me, saw my hand, and then I put my hand back, and you're like, hey, what's the text on Grogu again? And I say, I'm not telling you that, because I think I don't have to tell you anymore. That is also not cheating. The player needs to take action and be aware that it is an action that they're not allowed for them to take for it to be cheating. So this sort of communication cheating is very, very rare. It's more likely that a player has committed a gameplay disruption by communicating inappropriately. The Amazing Beaver says, if one forgot how many cards the deck holds at that time, would that still be called default? If your opponent says, hey, how many cards do you have in your deck? They ask me, how many cards do you have in my deck? And I say, I don't know, probably like 10, and I'm wrong. Ooh, that's not a great place to be. What you can do is count the number of cards in your deck, and then say, I count 13. There's also private information where players are allowed to bluff and in fact tell outright lies. You can say something as innocuous as every card in my hand is good, or I've resourced all of my late game threats, even if those aren't true statements. Players do not need to tell the truth about the attributes of these cards while they're hidden. However, if their opponent gains access to that information, like with Viper Probe Droid or Spark or some other effect, the revealed information is treated as open information for the duration of the effect, and they have to report about the attributes of revealed cards, even after they've been returned to being hidden. So I show you my hand that you see is a bunch of light side cards, and afterwards, once the hand's no longer revealed to you, I could be like, yes, these were the cards revealed, here are the stats, also it's all late game threats, which is just a statement regarding private information that you don't have access to. We also threw some cards off to the side. We need those later. But the Amazing Beaver says you're allowed to count as long as you don't look and shuffle. Yep, that is entirely correct. As long as the deck remains in the order and you don't gain any knowledge, you're absolutely allowed to count your deck size. This happens a lot in control mirrors when we get down to the final few turns. So, now we take a little step aside from written policy and we explore a couple flaws with written policy. So Super Rider O says, so we can see the order of cards put back in what order with 4 Cause. Yep, with 4 Cause, your opponent gets to see the order in which cards are returned to the top of the deck. This has been clarified in a rules clarification, but the way it works is you reveal the cards, you reorder them, and then you put them back on top, and so the order is known. Because you're not allowed to look at the cards in your deck, and so that reordering has to happen while you're looking at them. If it was put them back in a random order, then neither you nor your opponent would get to know. But there are a few flaws in policy as written that we're gonna interpret correctly, let's say. One thing that policy says is that players are not allowed to lie to judges or their opponent about open information, but doesn't say anything about private information. Players aren't allowed to lie to judges about private information. If we're like, hey, what if you resourced? What's in your hand? A player can't lie to a judge during an investigation. That, even if it's private information, they're not allowed to lie to the judge about it. You should not be asking these questions in front of their opponent because you don't want to give that information to their opponent. Similarly, it says that players cannot reveal private information. They can. If somebody plays Spark against me and they're like, oh hey, you have a Timely in hand. What does that do exactly? Either I can read Timely, or I can just show them the card again. You can only show information that you have access to, so you can't show your opponent your deck and be like, hey, what am I drawing soon? Am I drawing something good soon, or am I just dead? You're not allowed to do that. But you can show them your hand or your resources, because you're not gaining any advantage from that. It's information that you have access to. But if you want to communicate, like if your opponent's like, hey, what does Tech do again? You can just be like, here's Tech out of my resources. You know that he's there. Or Super Laser Technician. There's also a third category of information and knowledge, which isn't covered in the rules yet. It's something that I'm working with FFG to get formalized, that we call game knowledge or game information. Let's say if you just played 4 Cause, revealed 4 cards, put them back. One of them is Chewbacca, for Faithful First Mate, the pilot from Jump to Lightspeed. And your opponent says, hey, what's his power and HP again? And you honestly have no idea, because you only play him as an upgrade and not as a unit. Um, Previously revealed cards fall under open information, but you can no longer look at the card just like your opponent. And you don't know the answer to the question. Answering incorrectly is not allowed because you have to answer honestly about open information, but you don't know that information. This is where the third category of information comes in, game information or game knowledge. This includes all official documents covering rules and policy, as well as clarifications, as well as the text of all cards, whether they are in play or not. Players are not required to answer questions about game knowledge. You can't just quiz your opponent on every single card in a set. But if they do choose to answer the questions, they can't lie. Furthermore, players are entitled to this information and may call a judge to ask for this information. While we dig a bit deeper into the example we gave with Chewbacca, I want you to think about why we treat this information differently than either open information or hidden information. What are the consequences of treating it the same? If you've already read the lesson, you know the answer, but hey, if you haven't, take a minute to think about it. So, if your opponent says, hey, how big is Chewbacca if you play him as a unit, and you don't know the answer, you can say, I think he's a 5/5, but I never play him as a unit, so I'm not sure. I don't know, let's call a judge, or even just, I don't know. The first answer doesn't fully address the question, but it gives a good faith attempt and lets the opponent know that the information may not be accurate. And therefore, if they're like, okay, I just want to know if he was like a 1/1, a 5/5, or a 10/10, I don't need the specifics, I just want to know the general bracket we're working in. Or if they're like, you know what, I'll just call a judge. That's entirely fine. The second one, I don't know, let's call a judge. Also perfectly valid. That gets you the information and proffers a judge. The final one of I don't know is also valid. You're not required to answer questions. Because if you were required to answer questions, your opponent could be like, hey, what's the rules text of Dr. Aphra? And you're like, I don't play Dr. Aphra. And they're like, okay, cool. What's the rules text of Dr. Aphra? And you'd be in a bit of a bind. However, just being like, I don't know, is kind of crummy, and some people will consider you a bad sport. So being a little bit more proactive and helpful will help you develop a better reputation within your local community. Sometimes players will be salty about it. They'll be like, I don't know, or I don't have to tell you. And then like 2 minutes later, they will have a question about game information or game knowledge, and their opponent will just snark right back at them and be like, I don't have to tell you that. And it just leads to a game state where both players are a little bit salty with each other. Now, I asked you to consider why we're treating this group of information differently than open and hidden. We've already demonstrated why previously revealed cards sometimes don't work as open information, right? With the For Cause Chewbacca example. But let's dig a little deeper. If card attributes and game rules are private information, what happens? Well, then players can simply not answer or provide false and incomplete information about the rules in order to gain an advantage over their opponent. They could lie about how Sentinel works or something like that, and we obviously don't want that. On the other hand, if rules and policy and all that is open information, players have to answer these questions completely and accurately. Then a malicious player could ask their opponent, hey, what's rule 5.6.4 in the CR? Great, what's 5.6.5? What's 5.6.6? And call a judge when their opponent doesn't know the answer. And that also is obviously something we don't want. Hence, game knowledge. Players can't lie about it, but they also don't have to give an answer. But if they do know it, they don't need to get a judge involved. And so it's a little midway point. The Amazing Beaver asks, as a player would be allowed to have the Stars Unlimited deck database on phone next while the game, and be able to show them the card. So if this starts to run into electronic device policy. At casual tier, this is entirely fine. At competitive, you're generally going to want to call over a judge if you're going to have an electronic device out. You could bring up the offline judge tool created by our very own Donovan, which would allow you to be off, like at the start of the match, show your opponent, I am offline. I'm offline, I'm on airplane mode, I can't receive any information, because to be able to have an electronic device that you can see, it needs to be in airplane mode to get the card information. I'm pretty sure right now only Donovan's app is, or web page is the only thing that you can access offline that gives you the full card database. But if you had that, or if you're playing casual, you would be able to show the card database. Yes, absolutely. So, we've talked a little bit about what happens if a player unintentionally or intentionally breaks these guidelines. We investigate for cheating. If we determine that they broke these guidelines unintentionally, they think they remember his Chewbacca stat line and say he's a 5/5 when he's actually a 6/5. Or they tell their opponent that a Follower of the Way with an experience counter on it, or an experience token on it, is a 2/3 and not the accurate 3/4. For now, treat it like a gameplay disruption. They have broken the game rules regarding open and hidden information. However, the fix is a little bit different, because sometimes no actions have been taken based on this information. If I tell my opponent that the Follower of the Way, which is a 1/2 that gets +1/+1 when it's upgraded, is a 2/3, even though it should be a 3/4 because it has an experience token on it, and they choose not to attack with their 2 health Sentinel because they want to keep their Sentinel alive, the fact that the follower was larger than I said it was doesn't actually change that player's line of play at all. And so we don't need to reverse that. We don't need to rewind to that point because the decision would have been the same whether it was a 2/3 or a 3/4. Similarly, if I say it's a 2/3 and pass, and you're like, okay, cool, I'm going to claim the initiative because that's all I have left to do anyways, I just wanted to know how big it was, and then I pass, and then we go to resource and draw, and nothing has happened. Again, like, going back in time doesn't change the information that was said, and so we only need to undo actions that were based on the incorrect information. This does require determining a player's intentions and how they may have changed, which can require some investigation and may result in a backup, and is a little bit more intense than your standard gameplay error or gameplay disruption. All of this will require further questions, and both of these topics, investigations and backups, will be covered in upcoming Level 2 lessons. Again, if you do a backup based on incorrect communication, you shouldn't back up to the point of error, to the point of miscommunication, but instead back up to the point where a player acted or chose not to act based on the incorrect information, which very often is much more recent than the incorrect information. This is because everything between the information and the action won't change, and backing up further than we need to only causes more risk of us damaging the game state and getting away from a natural game. But that's it for these lessons. If you have any last minute questions before we end this broadcast, I realize I've been talking for nearly an hour and a half, and holy crap, my voice is not loving it. Thank you all, as always, for joining me. We will not have a broadcast this Friday, as I will be traveling to SCGCon Richmond to take part in the Magic Regional Championship. We will have our next broadcast next Tuesday, which will be the 20th, which will be the last broadcast for a while, as the kids say. On Friday the 23rd, I will be in Minneapolis, Minnesota, hosting a meetup for judges who are attending Regional Qualifier for Star Wars Unlimited, hosted in Minneapolis. On the 27th and the 30th, I'll still be in Minneapolis working with our friends at FFG in offices on a few larger projects. So that means after Tuesday's broadcast on the 20th, our next broadcast will be our monthly Q&A with Tim Shields on June 3rd. And yes, I'm going to Hartford, not Richmond. The brain is exactly where it needs to be, and I'm perfectly fine and cogent, and it'll all work out. Thank you all so much, and I'll see you in a week.